Hello, I'm Peter Drake. Welcome to the Drake Report. Consumer debt has received a lot of attention in the past few years. It's important because the extent to which consumers are leveraged can be an indicator of their ability to consume more in the future. Consumer debt is also an indicator of the ability of a population to absorb shocks to the economy that may result in job loss or a decline in the value of assets. This was well illustrated in what happened in the United States. The global financial crisis began there, ignited at least in part because too many consumers loaded up with too much debt, mainly to participate in a booming housing market. It became a crisis when housing prices fell, many lost their jobs, and those who were over-leveraged were unable to cope with their required debt payments. More recently, the discussion about consumer debt has spread to Canada. Consumer debt has continued to rise here, also fueled in part by borrowing to purchase homes whose prices had been rising rapidly. There are many different ways we can measure debt in Canada. At one level, it can be measured by the total amount of debt owed by each individual, debts such as credit cards, car loans, mortgage loans, and so on. In August of 2010, total household debt in Canada was around $1.5 trillion, up about 7% from a year earlier and continuing to grow. At another level, consumer debt is measured in relation to personal disposable income, that is, personal income after the tax has been paid. This measure is relevant because what matters is that borrowers have enough income to service the debt, to pay the interest, and repay the principal. In Canada, the debt to disposable income ratio has soared from well under 100% in the 80s and 90s to over 140% in 2010. The third way consumer debt is measured is in relation to household assets. The rationale here is that even if a consumer has a high debt load, it may be manageable if that same consumer has enough assets that some could be sold to pay down the debt. All of this tells us that the amount of debt Canadians have accumulated over the past 20 years is substantial. And, as was pointed out in a recent speech by the Governor of the Bank of Canada, households have now run a net financial deficit for 37 consecutive quarters. What that means is that households are demanding funds from the rest of the economy rather than providing them, as had been the case through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Going forward, it will be important for Canadians to manage their debt load and be aware of the associated risks. But that doesn't mean we will necessarily see a debt crisis in Canada similar to the one we saw in the United States. There are some important differences between the two countries. One is the difference in housing market behavior. Housing prices in Canada rose sharply, but not as sharply as in the United States. And when they corrected in Canada, they did so much less than in the United States. So, a decline in the value of assets, values against which the loans were made, hasn't been the issue in Canada that it was in the United States. Another important difference is that lending standards appear to be higher in Canada. In other words, Canadian lenders tend to do a thorough check of the potential borrower's ability to repay. That means that the likelihood that borrowers will be able to repay is higher. Helping that is the fact that employment losses in Canada were only a fraction of what they were in the United States. There are also differences in the regulations around mortgage borrowing that make it more likely that Canadian borrowers will service their loans. And the experience of several economic downturns over the past few decades tells us that Canadian borrowers will go to great lengths to pay their mortgage and keep their home. So, what can we conclude? Recently, the Governor of the Bank of Canada reminded us that Canadian debt to disposable income ratio is at an all-time high, and that Canadian households are increasingly vulnerable to adverse shocks. But he also noted Canadians may be starting to address these vulnerabilities. It's time for sensible caution by the financial regulators, by the lenders, and most important, by the consumers who borrow. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join me next time.